Hello, everybody. Thank you, Maya, so much. I had to pause many times as Maya was speaking, as I've had to pause in the last 3 weeks to remember my lineage of survivors and fighters, to think on many times this moment in history that I've studied historically and legally, to think viscerally about how did my ancestors survive the Nakba? How did any people survive apocalypse and choose in that moment to continue to rebuild rather than to surrender in despair? And for Palestinians in particular, not only in the aftermath of Nakba, not only to refuse, surrender, and despair, but to provide the world a vision, a future, of coexistence, of articulating a model. The first articulation in 1968, a non-sectarian model of a single state for all people, for Muslim, Christian, and Jewish to belong in the middle of ongoing removal, in the enshrinement and celebration of Zionist settler sovereignty, and still to offer that emancipatory vision. And this is before 1967. I remember that spirit. I remember it in Maya's powerful presentation. I remember it in the visions of our people who are picking up their dead and still praying for mercy upon others as they say into the camera, I wish this happens to no one else. And yet, in that very precise moment as we're gathering and conjuring strength, we are also in the middle of empire and global superpower, forced to contend. The moment that we look up from our grief and our prayer, to look up and to contend with the head of state who tells us, you did not die. Your grief is not real. I saw pictures that do not exist. That was self-fire even though we provided the weapons. And then to appear on people who call themselves news broadcasters, who rather than do their job of investigation, of research, of scrutiny, instead are reading state propaganda verbatim, over and over and over. Even though we have been doing this work intellectually in scholarship for decades, even though especially since 2008 when the systematic onslaughts of the besieged Gaza Strip began, we have been educating, where is Gaza? What is Hamas? What is Palestine? What is settler colonialism? What is the structure of violence? Why is apartheid a crime against humanity? We have produced resource upon resource that have not been read, that have not been studied, only to emerge in this moment to tell us to be asked, why do you not deserve to be killed? This is the moment that we have come to. And so I do not come to this teaching to ask for anything else except to emphasize that to begin and to end with a call for ceasefire now, which is a call to end this ongoing Nakba now. The call for ceasefire is the bare minimum, and it is unequivocal. It should not be coupled with any other demands, because to couple it with any other demands is to say that genocide in some cases is justifiable.
That's right.
And no one would say that. No one has said that, and yet that is what we are being told in this moment. So So how is it that I want to share that with you? I want to do it in a few ways, right? The first is to uplift the point that the erasure of Gaza and the history of Palestine is a deliberate one that is manufactured in order to build on an infrastructure of the war on terror, to build on Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian racial tropes in order to convince audiences, well-meaning audiences, that we have no choice but to end this through a military solution that is not legally regulated, where there is no moral pause, where there should be unfettered ability for the only nuclear power in the Middle East to use all force at its disposal against a predominantly refugee population where 50% of them are children. That is the message we have been told over and over. That is the reason media narratives censor us and refuse to allow us to provide context. We are not providing context to justify. We are providing context to insist that there is no military solution, that there is only a political solution, one that has been provided and one that is not being paid attention to, and one that has been swept to the side opportunistically, and I say that with deliberation and intent, opportunistically, in order to finish a project of Palestinian removal, in order to complete the fantasy of the removal of all Palestinians and uncontested settler sovereignty. That is the reason we provide this history. The reason is to insist upon what we have been saying already, that there is a political solution. And it's been the apathy of the international community to build on that political solution that has gotten us to this moment. When they ask me to condemn, the only bodies I want to condemn are ourselves, are the international community that has basically told Palestinians, there is no solution for you, except for cages, tighter cages, perhaps pretty cages, and war from time to time with incremental privileges. That is not a future for anybody. The second, so let me do that really quickly. Professor Mikdashi did a brilliant job. There is, this is historical Palestine here. The objective, I think very simply, settler colonialism is built on a set of twin axioms of taking the maximum amount of land without the natives on it and placing the maximum amount of natives on the smallest amount of land. And we see that. We see it very clearly in the West Bank, where it's obvious, where there's 224 ghettos, Bantustans, reservations, what you might refer to as derivative sovereignty, autonomy. We can define it in many which ways. But this is the archipelago that exists in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas, where there are no rockets, where the most compliant Palestinian leader in history governs, Mahmoud Abbas, who is part of the US and Israeli sphere of influence and uses international funding to police Palestinians and to protect settlers from Palestinians and to protect settlements rather than to protect Palestinians. This is the Negev. This is within what is described as the 1948 lines. This process of removal, concentration, dispossession is not limited to the occupied Palestinian territories of 1967, but exists also within what's been recognized as a political fact and in the state of Israel. This ongoing process of removal now is in the south, where Palestinians are removed from the Naqab, the Negev Desert, also known as the Negev Desert, in order to displace them and build settlements here. It also exists in Gaza through warfare. We've seen in the past about 10 years of warfare the ability to use war to also shrink these lines through the establishment of buffer zones, a military discourse of buffer zones that accomplishes the same purpose of taking the maximum amount of land with the least amount of people. And now we're seeing it very clearly in the proposal through the legal discourse. These are the new lines. This is 2023. of shrinking Gaza still further. This is the north. That's why they told 1.4 million Palestinians to evacuate the north, to head to the south of Gaza in order to shrink this line. But what we're seeing now in the bombing of the south, that the ambitions are far greater. They want to remove Palestinians altogether into the Sinai. A plan that is decades old, a plan that was at one point fantasy and competed with the disengagement plan of 2005, but is now, as a leaked think tank report has described it, a rare and unique opportunity to fulfill this plan that has been accompanied by $1 billion of aid package to Egypt to accept them. Okay? So this is an overall framework, and I forgive me for not providing you a lot of detail, which I'll answer in the Q&A, but detail if you'd like, okay? About the 2005 disengagement plan from Gaza. Detail if you would like about Hamas, which is the nascent sovereign of Palestinians, that has a political wing that was democratically elected and unable to fulfill its mandate, given the opportunity to govern and to fail, but instead has been met with siege immediately. That also has a military wing that we can assess and decry and criticize. But to frame Hamas altogether as floating outside of history and not part and parcel of actually a Palestinian national movement, right, is to disavow an entire history of the Palestinian freedom struggle. This is not Hamas is not exogenous to the Palestinians. And the members of it are actually not the monsters that they're telling us are members of it. Most of them might not even believe in the ideology or support the party at all, but who are aged 17 to 35-year-old men who have been given no hope, who have been disavowed by the international community, who will be reproduced. What will happen? What will happen when Hamas disappears? Will these memories fade? Will this trauma go away? Will the disavowal of Palestinians and their abject disregard be forgotten by the young babies who have woken up without shelter and without parents and without families? What is the solution? What is the solution if we do not acknowledge that this is not a national security issue, but this has been and remains and will continue to be a struggle for freedom? Also ask me, if you'd like, about how the language of war has been used and manipulated, and the more, the legal scholarship here of how Israel has actually shrunk the category of civilians to make this possible. How they've changed an assessment of proportionality in warfare to make it forward-looking so that they won't even decry this as disproportionate. But let me just, with the time that I have left, focus on the points on genocide, hostages, and ceasefire. On genocide, genocide as established in 1948 by treaty is this intent to destroy in whole or in part a people based on their racial, ethnic, national, or religious identity. The most important element of genocide is not the gravity of those killed, it is the intent to destroy, a specific intent. And genocide is thus prosecutable, even if no one is killed, but the intent exists. Okay? Let's understand that point. Here we have irrefutable evidence preceding October 7th that there is an intent to destroy, in whole or in part. When we saw settler programs that were supported by the Israeli military attack Hawara and attack Turmusaya to depopulate, and an explicit message from leaders in government who said, wipe Hawara off the map. When Ayelet Shaked, who is the justice minister, says, we must kill Palestinian mothers because they birth snakes. there is an intent to destroy in whole or in part based on a dehumanizing language that now we are seeing echoed in a language of war and parroted in media, where these military and political leaders are given a platform to justify it. When Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, says, "We will impose siege. These are human animals." When the President of Israel says, Isaac Herzog says, there are no Palestinian civilians. When Ghassan Aliyan, the General Commander of the occupied territories, explains there is siege, there will be hell, you asked for hell, we are being told over and over what the specific intent is. How is that specific intent then manifested? We see it in the lack of provision. There's no regulation of this war. Zero. So the high numbers that we see are not an accident. It's not collateral damage. Water has been cut off. Electricity has been denied. Fuel is not available. Humanitarian convoys that were given a safe route to go from the north to the south were attacked. Shelters, 29 UN schools have been shot. 8 of them were providing shelter at the time. 12 out of 35 hospitals have been debilitated through aerial bombardment or through the deprivation of electricity. This is not a war against Hamas. This is a war against Palestinians. And in Gaza in particular, it is a war against children. It is a war against children. 7,000 Palestinians have been killed in 3 weeks. 3,000 of them are children. Let me just based on calculations of the rate of killing, the number of children that has been killed is equivalent to all kindergarten children in Honolulu, or in New Orleans, or in Cleveland. All of them. At this rate, 1,481 children will be killed next week, bringing that number to 5,000, which would be equivalent to all high school students in Boulder, Colorado. Understand the extent of this devastation. Now, juxtapose it to Israel's military objectives. Why are they telling us they're fighting this war? What do they want to achieve? They want to destroy Hamas. They want to return the hostages and the captured soldiers. They want to turn Palestinians against Hamas in rebellion. They want to make Israel safer. They have dropped an equivalent of a nuclear bomb. The only nuclear power in the Middle East has dropped the equivalent of the nuclear bomb onto a besieged population without humanitarian corridors in 3 weeks, and have achieved none of those military objectives. Even by a military analysis that balances military advantage to harm caused, it is disproportionate. There has been no military advantage. 4 hostages have been released. They were released through diplomatic negotiations. Israel has said that Hamas saying that it'll release the hostages through negotiations is mendacious propaganda, except now it is in advanced negotiations mediated by Qatar and Egypt to release another 50 hostages in exchange for life-saving fuel necessary. So this military operation is in fact not even advancing a military goal, which reveals to us what genocide scholars have said, what legal scholars have said, what survivors in Bosnia and Rwanda and Germany have said. This is a textbook case of genocide. So when the US is vetoing a Security Council resolution, when the head of state is fomenting this violence, when media are failing to take a critical role, when Austria is outlawing the anti-colonial slogan from the river to the sea. When France and Germany are making Palestinian protests illegal, they are all aiding and abetting a genocidal campaign aimed at the destruction in whole or in part of the Palestinian people. Demanding an end to this, demanding an end to the second Nakba, demanding a ceasefire now is the bare minimum. It is non-negotiable. It should not be coupled with any other demands. The Palestinians could be the worst people on earth. They can have the blackest hearts. Nothing justifies genocide. And yet that is what we are being fed. That is what we are being told. That is how we are being primed to accept these mass numbers of death. And so I end by saying there is no military solution. There is only a political outcome. We have been advocating for this outcome. We must continue to raise up this knowledge, not to point fingers, not to condemn, but to insist on that outcome, to insist on ceasefire now, to insist on ending an ongoing Nakba right now. Thank you.